The Pentagon has denied the US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth held a formal meeting with Defence Minister Richard Marles during his visit to Washington, D.C. earlier this week. A Pentagon official has described the catch-up as a happenstance encounter instead. Both the Greens and the Coalition say the US is treating the Albanese government with contempt. Here's Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedjets. And Stephen, what exactly happened with the Defence Minister and the US Defence Secretary, and what's the political fallout been?
Yeah, Dan, this is, to be frank, a pretty curious story. So back on Sunday, the Defence Minister announced that he would make a trip to Washington, D.C. This has been stood up, or had been stood up, very, very quickly. I understand, only over a week or so. So this was not something that had been long planned. This had, for whatever reason, been organised at fairly short notice. Now, the Deputy Prime Minister said in that statement that he was looking forward to meetings with Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary, as well as other senior members of the administration. But what became pretty clear once Richard Marles arrived in Washington, D.C. is that perhaps because of the chaos in Washington at the moment, particularly at the Pentagon, it was difficult to nail down a meeting, particularly because the Defence Secretary had so many other commitments. Now, understandably, Australian officials scrambled to organise something. In the end, they did manage to organise a catch-up between the two men after Mr Marles had sat down for a meeting with, ironically, a more senior member of the administration, namely J.D. Vance, the Vice President. Now, Mr Marles never described that catch-up as a meeting, but he did say he took the opportunity to reaffirm all the ties that have existed between Australia and the US for some time. And then overnight we had a rather unusual development when the Pentagon, through an official, put out a comment saying that they did not have a, quote, meeting, but rather a, quote, happenstance encounter, which is, to be frank, a strange thing for the Pentagon to do, given the closeness of the relationship. They seem to be pouring cold water quite deliberately on the significance of the meeting. Now, basically, the government has been in something of damage control mode since then, trying to point out a few things. One, things are very quicksilver and unpredictable in Washington at the moment. And two, even though this meeting or encounter, happenstance encounter with the Defence Secretary was a brief one, the Deputy Prime Minister still got FaceTime with senior officials, including, most importantly, the Vice President. And that was the point that Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, wanted to make earlier today. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
The Deputy Prime Minister of Australia met with the Vice President of the United States, and Secretary Rubio has a number of roles, crucial roles. I haven't had a debrief from Richard on the discussions he had with the Defence Secretary as well. But by any objective measure, going to the US and meeting with people of that seniority in the administration when we have so many issues at play, I find it quite strange, frankly, to see some of this kind of kickback about the trip. I think Richard, as always, is engaging with the American counterparts enthusiastically, diligently, professionally.
So, Stephen, why does this dispute matter?
Yeah, I mean, it does, on the face of it, look like a very abstract dispute. How you describe a meeting, do you call it a meeting or not? But I think a couple of things are just worth noting quickly. One, there's no doubt that Richard Marles wanted a meeting with Pete Hegseth. He said that from the outset. And whilst, of course, a meeting with J.D. Vance is critical and important and a sign of, good access for Australia, the reality is that some of the things that Australia really wants to press hard on, including on AUKUS, they're things that are going to be decided within the Department of Defence before ultimately being decided by the US President, and Pete Hegseth is the critical man there. And if things are so chaotic in Washington at the moment that Richard Marles can't secure even a brief formal meeting with the Defence Secretary, then it speaks to one of two things. One, that Australia doesn't rate highly enough in Pete Hegseth's calendar to actually get a formal meeting. Or two, and perhaps this is just as likely, there is such a level of uncertainty and upheaval in Washington at the moment. Remember, we've seen recently sackings of multiple senior officials over the last few weeks, and including recently in both the DOD and more broadly, that the works are now so gummed up in Washington that important meetings like this are going by the wayside. The other thing that I think is worth noting here is the fact that the Pentagon was so dismissive in the way that it described it, and describing it quite deliberately as a happenstance encounter. Nobody was forcing the Pentagon to put this statement out at all, And to use such cold language about a close ally, I think shows dismissiveness. So I think that's why it's caught quite a bit of attention, and why I think it's likely that the Defence Minister is going to continue to face quite a few questions on this.
Stephen Jedjet's reporting from Parliament House in Canberra.